I growled as the bawling cut across my dreams. This was my third night in the box, and I was getting tired of being woken up by the loud crying from somewhere in the quad. The inmate spent his days in an almost abject silence, no one stopping at his cell with mail or call-outs or any of the usual stuff. I never saw them come out for showers. I don't even think I'd seen them get a tray during meals. All they really did was cry at night and keep the whole block awake. I huffed out a long, suffering breath and rolled on my bunk. My cellmate, an old guy named Tobbs, looked over the edge at me and shrugged. He reached up for his ears and pulled out a pair of earplugs he had made out of toilet paper and held them out to me. I just shook my head, knowing they wouldn't block out the crying. After getting zero sleep on my first night, I tried talking to the man and finally just gave up. It seemed that the crying couldn't be blocked out by normal means, and my brain simply couldn't be tired enough to block it out completely. "It helps a little," Tobbs lied, but he smiled as he said it, the light from outside making his grin look ghastly. "What's his problem anyway? What's he got to be so upset about?" I asked grumpily. That wiped the smile off of Tobbs' face, and I saw him roll away and face the wall. "It's best not to think about it. He's just getting by in his own way." That seemed to be Tobbs' way of saying, leave it alone. I had been a guest of Stragview prison for about 3 years now, but this was my first trip to the box. They had caught me in a shakedown a few weeks ago, and some jackass had decided to hide their drugs under my bunk. The guards hadn't wanted to hear about how it wasn't mine. Possession was 9/10 of the law, after all, and I was processed and whisked off to confinement. 3 days later, I was exhausted and ready to snap. I rolled over and tried to block out the crying and get back to sleep. The next day, I tried to ask Officer Malkin about the inmate, but he just told me to shut the hell up and take my tray. Malkin was a grumpy night shift guard that seemed to think that shut the hell up was synonymous with good morning. I probably wouldn't get anything out of him, so I figured I'd wait for the day shift to arrive. Officer Timius was a pretty bubbly guy, and he could usually be counted on for some conversation. When day shift arrived, though, Timius looked at me like he didn't know what I was talking about. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about, inmate. You must be mistaken." And he wandered on with the call-out sheet. "Best to just drop it, kid. It's just one of those things it's best not to ask about." I nodded at him, but his answer made me more curious than anything. What was the guy's deal? Was he just crazy or what? And why didn't anyone tell him to shut the hell up? I knew I wasn't the only one he was keeping awake, and the idea of a bunch of cons just letting this guy lose them their hard-earned sleep made my head hurt. My situation only got worse around lunchtime, when Sergeant Mefford arrived with Timius and Sergeant Basford from the captain's office. They cuffed us, told me to move to the back of the cell, and told Tobbs to approach the door. They opened the door and pulled him out, keeping a wary eye on me like I might charge them in handcuffs. Once he was out, they closed the door and took the cuffs off, telling him his time was served and he was being released from confinement. He looked back once to give me a grin and a thumbs up as Basford led him towards the quad door, towards the outside world. And just like that, I was stuck in that 12x8 cell by myself. Most people would have jumped at the chance to have a cell to themselves, but I wasn't as excited about it. Being alone in a small box with only myself for company gets old pretty quick. With a roommate, you have someone to talk to or play cards with, but alone, it's just you. I sat on my bunk as the quad buzzed with general noise, and it didn't take long for me to get bored. I spent the rest of the day trying to trade for a book, but only managed a ratty magazine that I devoured like a starving man. That night, the crying started again. It was just after lights out, and I was exhausted after sleeping so poorly the night before. I had just laid down, getting comfy as I prepared to pass out, when the deep, sorrowful crying began again. It echoed through the quad, bouncing off the walls, and seemed to circle like a hummingbird. I heard mutters and sighs, people trying to make the best of their situation and get some sleep, but the wailing just went on and on. It always stopped when one of the guards came in to do a round, and I would just get close to falling asleep when they would walk out, and the wailing and crying would start again. The crying stopped as the sun came up, but it was too late for me to sleep by then. I was exhausted from the days on end of having little sleep. I drowsed most of the day, roused for meals or mail call or call-outs, and the other common occurrences that happen in prison. I found myself napping fitfully, fully clothed so I'd be ready if someone important came in, and wanting nothing so much as to sleep for hours on end. Being in confinement, I could sleep if I wanted to, but with no escape from the noise or the bustle, I was left in a state of tiredness, knowing there would be no reprieval tonight. I blame the lack of sleep for what happened next, but I know it wasn't completely due to that. I was simply the first one to snap. That third night, it all became too much. The crying echoed across the quad, leaving many of us grumbling, but no one willing to say anything to him. This was very odd, since I'd heard guys yell at each other over whistling after 8 o'clock, and this guy was getting away with keeping the whole quad awake. When the officers came in at 10, I tried to get their attention, begging them to shut the guy up. My neighbor tried to shush me, but the guard just rolled his eyes and told me to sit down. I kept calling, but he ignored me, and soon the door was closing behind him. We all sat in the pregnant silence for a few minutes, and I thought he might have heard me ask the guard to talk to him, realizing he was a nuisance. I lay down on my bunk, the crunchy plastic mat sitting firmly against the hard metal rack, and closed my eyes as I tried to sleep. Maybe he would be quiet now. Maybe he was just sane enough to realize that he was driving us all nuts. Maybe he realized that, scared or not, someone would remember that he had kept them awake when they got back to the yard, and that someone would probably put a knife in him. I was almost asleep when the wailing echoed out again, louder than ever. That was when I snapped. "Shut up! Shut the hell up! People are trying to sleep!" I came off my bunk, face pressed against the glass on the door, as I yelled into the quad at the stupid idiot who was crying. I didn't care if the guards heard me or not. I just wanted the idiot to quiet down so I could sleep. Other people in the quad tried to shush me, telling me to be quiet before he heard me, but I didn't care. I wanted him to know what an asshole he was being, and I wanted him to stop that stupid wailing. When my yelling stopped echoing around the quad, I realized that the wailing had stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. The absence of the wailing now seemed strange, and the silence of my fellow inmates was equally as odd. I hadn't expected full-fledged applause, but I had expected a few complimentary comments. People usually celebrated someone willing to tell off a noisy inmate, and their lack of any kind of talk made me nervous. I went and sat down, leaving the quad in a state of absolute silence, as my eyes slid shut and I started trying to get some sleep. Who knew how long this wacko would be quiet for, and I wanted to get a little shut-eye before he started crying again. I had just started to slip off when I heard it. Tap, 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 tap. Someone was tapping the glass on my cell door. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was one of the guards wondering why I'd been yelling, and if I ignored them, they would just assume I was asleep. I felt my tired mind trying to slip off again when the tapping came a second time. Tap, 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 tap. I sighed and sat up, looking at the glass on the door. They made you sign a big long list of rules before you got a cell, and one of them was not yelling into the quad. Some guard who thought he was cute wanted to remind me of the rules, just to be a dick. I got half off my bunk before I caught a good look at the face on the other side of the glass. It was white, its eyes like hollow pits, and the fingers it raised were crusty with old blood. I moved as far from the door as I could, screaming and thrashing as it stood tapping at my door. The fingers tapped again and again as I tried to ignore it. I slid under my bunk, but they did little to block out the sounds of those dead fingers. I put my pillow over my head, but the hard canvas thing did nothing to block out the constant tapping. Who the hell was it? Was this some kind of crazy inmate who had gotten out? Some guard playing a trick? I wrapped the sheet and the blanket around myself as I tried to block him out, secure in the knowledge that at least I was safe behind that big rolling door. I lay under the scratchy blanket for a few more minutes, dreading the tapping, but listening nonetheless. The darkness beneath my blanket was broken by shafts of light as they cut through the thin material. The light streamed unhampered through the little glass of the door, and its uninterrupted shining made me realize that the face was no longer there. What was more, the tapping had stopped, and I felt a sigh slip out as I realized that whatever it was had moved on. I slid the covers down a little and glanced at the door, feeling relieved at the empty window before rolling onto my side to try to get some sleep. Just as my eyes closed, my head facing the familiar gray wall, did I see him leaning there amongst the shadows. He looked bored, unsure of himself, and now that I could see him clearly, he appeared young. His eyes were black, sunken pits that seemed devoid of any means of sight. He was skinny to the point of emaciation, and his grimy hands constantly gripped at the waistband of his prison uniform pants. His nails made a whispery sound across the fabric, and his dirty long nails were crusted with rusty red residue. As we made eye contact, I could see the residue's source. His throat had been cut deep enough to nearly detach his head, and gaped at me like a leering mouth. I had only a matter of seconds to take all this in before I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. There was little else I could do. I couldn't escape him. That door wouldn't open, no matter how hard I pulled at it. He didn't seem to want to jump on me and kill me, not yet anyway, and his silent watching made me think I could just ignore him. The idea of sleeping with this thing in the room was not an option, though. My only hope seemed to be to wait for the guards to come by on another round and notice him in there. What would they do if they saw it, though? Would they get rid of it? Could they get rid of it? My eyes pulsed behind my eyelids, hearing the whispery sound its nails made against its pants. The stiller I got, the more I became aware of its raspy breathing as it loomed against the wall. The darkness behind my eyelids seemed like a breath of fresh air compared to the nightmare that now inhabited my cell. I tried to stop myself from shuddering as I lay there, hearing its breathing and wishing for the wailing again. The wailing would have drowned out the scrabbling of its claws and the sucking gasps from its neck wound. Its flat feet made a plopping sound when it took a step towards me. I quivered beneath my blankets, hearing the harsh sound of its breath as it slithered through its neck wound. It took another step, the scratch of its nails having stopped now as it stepped closer. The cell was small, and it didn't have far to come before it was very close to my exposed face. I kept my eyes shut tight, the rattling of its damaged throat right in my face, and I had to work very hard not to start hyperventilating. It was close enough to shred my face with those crusty, bloody nails, and I remember thinking that if I could just get through this without shaking to pieces, I'd be very lucky. I wasn't aware right away when the breathing left, but when the cell lights came on, I realized I'd been trying not to scream for nearly 6 hours. I couldn't sleep that day either. It wouldn't come out during the daytime, but I knew it was there. If I lay on my bunk, I could hear that raspy neck breathing from under the bed as it hid in the dark crevices. It didn't like the light, it seemed, and it would only come out at night so it could hide in the dark corners and watch me. No one would talk to me. I had become a social pariah, and I sat in contemplation for most of the day, trying to figure out how to make this creature leave me alone. It was a long and boring day, and I had plenty of time to think, plenty of time to plan. The longer I thought about it, the more I believed that it had been the wailing that kept it away. The creature must have been afraid of the wailing inmate who lived in that room. Had I hurt his feelings or something? I needed to figure out how to make him start wailing again. If it scared this thing away, it would be worth the sleepless nights. I tried talking to him through the grate in the back window, tried sending him kites under the door, but nothing seemed to get his attention. After yelling myself hoarse and using all the paper I had in my possession, I felt like I only had one chance. Tomorrow was one of 3 shower nights we had every week. The guards always took me to the shower nearest my cell, the cell nearest to his cell. I could talk to him, make him understand how sorry I was. Maybe he would understand why I needed him to keep crying. I just had to make it one more night. That night was the worst night of my life. When the lights went out, that creature came slithering out from under my metal rack. I heard his nails scraping on the concrete floor as he drug himself out and turned my head to the wall as he rose to his full height. I couldn't see him, he couldn't get between the wall and my face, but I could see his shadow across the wall as he loomed over my prone form. His heavy breathing filled the cell as he rasped and husked, and I believed I would go crazy as I lay there watching his shadow. I was exhausted, near to my breaking point, but my fear kept me from snatching more than a few seconds of sleep at a time. My biggest fear was that he would simply fall on me and devour me, or slither into my bed and wrap his long, pale arms around me before breaking me like kindling. I didn't know what he wanted, was no closer to finding out what he wanted than I was at the start, but he spent that night much as he had the one before, bent over me and breathing soupily. When the cell lights came up, I breathed a sigh of relief as his shadow left me. I got up and moved to the top bunk. The bare mattress was cold against my skin, but I didn't care. I lay dozing, listening to his thick breathing and feeling afraid all over again. Guards offered me food, offered me rec, offered me cleaning supplies to clean my cell, but I spent the whole day ignoring them as I lay in a state of fitful insomnia. I was too afraid to sleep, too afraid to stay fully awake, and as the sun went down, I knew it was nearly time to enact my plan. I couldn't weather another night like the last two. I stripped down to my boxers, grabbed my towel, and was waiting when they came to get me. I kept close to the wall, aware that this was his time, even if the lights were on, and not wanting to get grabbed and miss my chance. I could still hear him under the bed, and I knew that all he was waiting for was a chance. When the flap came down and the guard told me to cuff up, I put my hands out and was restrained before the door rolled open. I walked out, turning towards the shower, before breaking away and running for the cell nearest the shower. The guard stumbled, yelling as he fell on his backside, and I heard the angry feet of his partner closing in. I'd only get one shot at this, and as I hit the door, I began to plead my case. I was so sorry. I shouldn't have spoken to him like that. Please start crying again, so the creature in my cell would... Before the guards hit me, though, I noticed my miscalculation. The cell was empty, free of inmates or mats or anything. There had never been anyone in that cell. Correction, there had been someone in that cell. When the guard tackled me, they dropped me on my jaw and dislocated it. A little overzealous, maybe, but they saved me in the long run. When they realized what had happened, they took me down to the infirmary so the nurses could reset my jaw. They wanted x-rays, wanted a second opinion, and I had been checked into the infirmary for the night. As I lay there, jaw hurting, I write this in my journal so that someone will know what has become of me when I return to my cell. I don't know what it wants, but I know why it's haunting me. I called it out, I acknowledged it, and now it has marked me. It hasn't followed me here. This is not the place it's tied to, I suppose. But if I return to that cell, it will find me, and they will find me dead in that place. The creature is the source of the wailing, but its constant staring is far worse than the nightly caterwauling. If they put me back in that cell, it won't have to kill me. A few more nights of that, and I'll do it myself. I'm still shaking. I can't believe what I've been a party to tonight. I was told to record, so I did. I didn't know how it would all shake out. How could I? Now I'm facing an investigation and may even have to go to prison myself. All because the bastard told me to keep recording. I work as a correctional officer in Stragview prison. As a male, most of my time is spent working in close management dorms or serving on special teams within the facility. For those who have never worked in a prison, close management is the kind of dorms you usually see on TV. Every cell is an 8x10 box where 2 men sleep per cell, with bunk beds set into the walls and doors that roll shut at night. I work the night shift, so life is usually pretty straightforward. After lights out, your charges are locked away until chow time in the morning. Other than hourly wellness checks to make sure that, no one's in distress, your hardest decision is which inmate to shake down for books or which corner to nap in until it's your turn to do a round. Our captain, Captain Rosand, is a nice enough guy who doesn't usually make our lives too hard. He's hard when he has to be, but he doesn't sweat the small stuff. I've seen him hold his ground in an emergency, standing against a quad of unruly inmates even when weapons were present. He's been my captain for about a year now, and my shift honestly couldn't have asked for a better one. On Monday, he wasn't the one to greet us after we'd had our bags and pockets checked in the security room. The captain that held our roster for the evening was a stranger. He had a head of thick, wiry gray hair and a beard to match. His thin build teetered on emaciation, and he had a pair of stormy eyes that seemed to be roving the crowd constantly. The group of COs that stood around the waiting area were utterly cowed by his menacing appearance. Even some of the sergeants seemed to be giving him a wide berth. I am Captain Peterson. Captain Rosand is ill tonight, and I am his replacement. His words had a quality that made me uneasy. He sounded like an old general in a war movie, addressing his troops just before all hell broke loose. He gave us our dorm assignments, and we all left in clumps as we discussed how odd he was. Sergeant Dack, the assigned yard sergeant for the night, was incredibly nervous about the prospect of having to work with him all night. He joked with the confinement sergeant, a mousy guy named McCann, that he might just come help him with paperwork instead. Turned out, there were a lot of us doing paperwork before the night was over. The night went by mostly as expected. Mail was handed out before first count. Master roster was concluded before lights out to ensure that everyone was present and accounted for. By 10:30, we had all of our inmates snugged in their cells. I was just deciding which counter to prop my feet up on when the phone rang. Dotson, the sergeant assigned to the dorm with me, rolled his eyes at it before saying to me, side-mouthed, "Sounds like this is the moment they've decided to get up to shenanigans." The statement would prove to be prophetic. It was Dak. He wanted an inmate from Quad 3, inmate Garman, in leg shackles and hand restraints to be brought down to the captain's office ASAP. Dotson nodded as he relayed this information to me, rolling his eyes theatrically. I started assembling the necessary items we would need to outfit Garman for his trip. When Dotson hung up, I asked him why they wanted Garman so late at night. Dotson only shrugged. "Dunno. Do you mind taking him, though? I'm up to my tits in paperwork, and I really need to get caught up." I agreed and went out to Quad 3 to get Garman ready to go. Garman was not happy about being rousted. Garman was in his late 30s, his short brown hair growing prematurely gray, with the thin, stoop-shouldered look common in inmates. He wanted to know what all this was about, and why they wanted him so late, and just how long this was going to take, and he wanted to know it all right now. I told him that Captain wanted to talk to him. If he had questions, then he'd better take it up with him. That seemed to finally get him into motion. When the captain called, it was never a good idea to keep him waiting. He balked again when I told him he'd have to wear the ankle chains, but at this point, it was just grumpy bluster. We got his hands secured behind his back, his leg restraints in place, and I called him in over the radio as Dotson buzzed us out onto the compound. The compound at night is probably the most peaceful place in the world. Prisons are almost always set up to be out in the middle of nowhere, and it seemed to be by design. When the lights go out and the children go to bed, the dorms look almost peaceful. The crickets and the night birds were the only sound around us as we walked. I saw Garman look around and take it all in, with the kind of resignation only the incarcerated can manage. We often forget when we put on the uniform that some inmates are still human too. Not all of them get to keep their humanity here, but some of the lucky ones are strong enough to not let this place turn them into animals. Some officers are lucky enough to keep that humanity too. The captain's office is a square concrete building in the middle of the compound. It's close enough to every dorm that you could run to someone's aid in about a minute from the front door. Dak was waiting for us when we arrived. He was usually a good-natured fella, quick with a joke or a sarcastic remark. Tonight, though, he was standing over a little pile of crumpled cigarettes, and he looked haggard. He looked up at us as we approached and threw something to me that I almost dropped. It was the video camera that we used for disturbances. Anytime an inmate needed to be put on camera, you could bet that he was about to have a bad time. I had run the camera a few times, mostly to monitor inmates after they'd been sprayed with gas or slammed to the ground. I knew enough to figure out that this wasn't going to be an ordinary meeting. "What's this for?" Dak took a long drag off his Winston and added it to the pile. "Cap wants the meeting recorded." "Any particular reason?" I didn't like seeing Dak this short and out of sorts. "No clue, but would you please do it? Peterson, Cap, I mean, I don't want to spend any more time in there with him than I have to." "Why? What's going on, Dak?" I'm going to confinement to help McCann with paperwork. Come find me when you're done, okay?" "Dak, what the hell is going on?" Dak looked at me, and I could tell for the first time that he was scared. "That guy, he's not right, man. I don't know what it is, but I know that I don't want to spend any more time with him than I have to. Just do this for me, will you? Please?" And it was the please that really did it for me. I told him I would, and Dak slumped off towards confinement. I walked Garman in and knocked on the front door of the captain's actual office. The outer room held a computer, a copy machine, and a couple of filing cabinets that usually held people's lunch boxes or the crap that officers took from inmates. The outer office was empty, which was a first. Usually the place was full of officers and sergeants who had escaped their dorms to hang out with their friends at the captain's office. The absence of other officers should have been a second red flag, but I shrugged it off and knocked on the door a second time. "Come in," said Captain Peterson. When I came in, he was finishing up a phone call. His eyes got big when he saw Garman, and he lost his train of thought for a second. Garman stood before his desk, unimpressed with the wild gray gentleman who sat behind it, and looked around the office as Peterson finished his phone call. Peterson dragged his eyes away from him with difficulty and turned his attention back to the phone. No, Mary, I have to go. Yes, I intend to go through with it. Don't worry. After tonight, it won't matter. I love you too. Good night. And with that, he hung up the phone. He reached around it and unplugged the cord, rising from the desk as he did so, and walking around to look at me. He stood much too close to me, and I could almost smell his sweat as he bent to look me in the eye. His sweat did not smell altogether healthy. Do you know how to operate that? He asked, indicating the camera. Sir, yes, sir, I said, trying not to let him hear my discomfort. I want you to record our interview. I want you to record, and I don't want you to stop. No matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, no matter what inmate Garmin or I might say, I want you to keep recording. Can you do that? That made me nervous. What had I walked into? Garmin did not seem too keen on our conversation either, but since he was the one in restraints, he didn't really have a lot to say on the matter. As I stood there, the captain's manic gaze fixed on me, I found myself nodding and opening the camera to begin. I pushed the button labeled record and moved back a little to frame the scene for whoever was going to watch it later. The captain stepped out of frame and locked the door. Then he sat behind his desk, and for a moment the two just stared at each other. Do you know who I am, inmate? You're the captain, right? Garmin scoffed. Captain Peterson mulled this answer over for a minute. He sat behind the desk, leaning in to look at Garmin, and I took the advantage of the lull to take a step back into one of the corners, so the two were both in frame. Garmin standing before the desk, and Pearson sitting at it, were easy to get into shot. I wanted everything in sight for whatever reason I was recording this. I didn't want anyone to claim something afterwards that I didn't get on tape. Peterson chewed over Garmin's answer, and it didn't seem to satisfy him. Do you know who I am? He asked again, something unsettling creeping into his voice. Look, Cap, Garmin said, rolling his eyes, if you called me down here to play games, then let's just skip the crap, and you tell me. Both Garmin and I jumped as Peterson slammed his hands down on the desk. When he looked back up, his eyes were full of terrible knowledge, and when he spoke, his voice was full of barely controlled rage. Do you know who I am? He bellowed, spit flying into Garmin's stunned face. Garmin stood petrified, and Peterson was forced to answer his own question. My name is Frederick James Peterson, you piece of human garbage. Does that ring a bell? Garmin stammered a little, but seemed unable to answer. You were convicted of murder. Isn't that so, inmate Garmin? Yes, Garmin stuttered, a big glob of spit sliding down his cheek as he tried to speak. Your record says murder, but that's not the whole story, is it, Garmin? Garmin didn't answer, but Peterson didn't seem to require one. I bet not too many of these other fellas know why you're here, do they, Garmin? You tell them that it's for murder. Maybe you were wrongly convicted after defending yourself. We know better, though, don't we? You see, you're a child killer, aren't you, Garmin? No, Garmin breathed, wincing out the words as though they might hurt him to think about. The captain moved quicker than I would have thought him capable. One moment he was sitting, and the next he was up and over the desk. Garmin's head snapped to the side as Peterson's open palm connected with his face. He staggered back, startled and hurt, but kept his feet in the face of the grinning apparition who now sat atop the desk. Don't you dare lie to me, you piece of shit! You were convicted of murdering 13 children between the ages of 9 and 13, weren't you? When Garmin didn't answer, he hit him again, and this time I saw a line of blood dribble down his chin as he brought his head back up. I took a step forward, meaning to stop this. Peterson fixed me with a crazed eye, though, and I took a step away again. Those eyes told me plainly not to get involved, not to come between them. He didn't want to hurt anyone but Garmin, but he would if I got in his way. Didn't you? He shouted, and this time Garmin looked up. Yeah, that's right. I'm a child killer. I'm a child murderer amongst murderers. So what? He asked, blood spattering out of his mouth onto the captain's uniform. Peterson hit him again. But it was no open-hand swing this time. He hit him full in the face with a closed fist, and this time Garman's blood pattered across the floor in a torrent. He cried out, high and pathetic, and Peterson turned his face towards him as he drank in his anguish. I thought again about stopping this, but Peterson's display had scared me into submission. You don't often see someone in authority, at least not someone in this line of work, lose their cool so utterly and so quickly. That's right, Garman. You're a child killer, but that's not all there is to it, is there? You didn't just murder them, you abducted them. Garman gagged on his own blood, but still managed to shake his head in negation. Peterson hit him again, and this time I heard his jaw pop as Peterson's fist flashed across it. He hit him 3 more times, a quick 1, 2, 3 in succession. When his head came to rest, I feared his jaw might be broken. Don't you dare lie to me, Garman. You abducted them, you tortured them in your basement, and killed them as they hung crying from your rack. You sit in the chow hall, in the library, laughing with your little friends on the quad, and all the time, you know what you are. You know that you deserve to die for what you've done. Garman had hunched down, trying to cover himself as the captain lunged at him again. Instead of his fist, however, he put a boot in his guts and set him sprawling against the filing cabinets in his office. I heard his head connect with the metal box and saw the bright spray of red as his scalp broke open. I lowered the camera and tried to go to him, tried to stop this from escalating any further, but Peterson shoved me away and screamed at me to keep recording. The camera shook as I lifted it again. I wanted to stop. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to leave the two alone. I realized now that my presence meant very little to him. I was merely a means to an end. At your trial, I sat in the gallery and prayed that someone would grant you the death that you so deserve. I prayed and prayed that you would feel the terror of waiting on the needle right up until they slid it into your veins. I wanted you to suffer as I had, as my Catherine must have before you. But at that, he took the inmate's shoulders and slammed him into the cabinet again. The blood flew then. Garman's blood splattered onto the cabinet and flew onto the walls. I imagined I could see his skull beneath the torn scalp, and as I sank to my backside on the floor, I could do nothing to turn aside. My Catherine was beautiful. She was pure, and you took her from me. Then that soft-hearted judge gave you life. Life in prison. Did you give my Catherine life? No, you ended her life. I've looked for you for the last 5 years so I could give you the same thing you gave her. Finding you became a sort of mania in me, you see. When my wife left me, when my friends stopped calling, when my son went to live with her because he couldn't stand to see what Catherine's death had done to me, I blamed you and added just one more sin to your tally. As he stood, he took his frustration out on Garman. The man was limp, unconscious if not already dead, but Peterson went right on abusing him. He punched him, he stomped him, he slammed his head and stomped his fingers. And by the end, the man looked like clay that had been worked over by an untalented child. I am your judge, Garman, your judge, your jury, and your executioner. Garman's blood had coated the overhead light, bathing the room in a pool of red. The spreading pool of blood from Garman accentuated the room. Peterson hunched over Garman's body, panting like a dog as Garman slowly bled his life away. He rose, graceless, and turned to glare at me. His face was a mask, stained with blood and pits of viscera. He looked like an angry god, like some old totem unearthed by a violent storm, and as he approached, I was filled with a deep and resonant fear. He loomed over me, and I could see him putting those fists to work on me as I sat hunkered in the corner. He bent and took the camera from my numb hands. Then he left through the door, pushing it open and walking from the office like nothing had happened. That was, 12 hours ago. I sat in the office hyperventilating as the phone began to ring. I let it ring. I had no strength left after what I had witnessed, and the phone going unanswered brought Dak back to the office. When he saw Garman slumped across the cabinet and covered in blood, and me cowering in the corner, he called the major. The police arrived shortly after that, along with the warden, the inspector, and internal affairs. I told my story repeatedly. By the 8th retelling, I felt ready to scream. No camera footage existed of the events in his office. He unplugged the camera in the ceiling, and the only footage on file is me bringing Garmin from the dorm to the office. Dak told me that Cap had wanted to speak with Garmin, and Dotson corroborated the call. That took my name off the top of their list, but it still didn't answer where Captain Peterson had gone. Captain Peterson, as it turned out, was the father of Catherine Peterson. Catherine had been Garmin's last victim, and the victim that had finally seen him caught. However, Garmin had information about a child sex ring that he had been selling tapes to in exchange for a lesser sentence. Garmin had assaulted many of his victims on camera, and the videos had been netting him a high profit with that particular brand of pervert. He flipped on them, which allowed his record to say nothing about how he had murdered children. A dozen perverts off the street and one murderer behind bars for life was probably a fair trade in the court's eyes. Captain Peterson, though, had disagreed. They still haven't found Captain Peterson or the video camera. There's no footage of him leaving the facility, and the only way to get in and out is through the front gate. That means he's still on the compound somewhere. He's still there, maybe plotting violence against another inmate, perhaps just reviewing the footage like a scholar studying catechism. I had no choice, you understand. I had to keep filming. Even if I had stopped, it wouldn't have changed anything. The inspector didn't like that answer, but you see the truth of it. As I lay in my bed now, I can see the last image of Peterson superimposed behind my eyes. I see that blood-stained man coming towards me, and I wonder if I've indeed seen the last of him. Work release isn't like an ordinary prison. If you're unfamiliar with how the prison hierarchy works, let me explain. You have maximum security institution, places with barbed wire on the fences and men in cages inside concrete structures, whose days are basically dictated by the guard's will. Then you have minimum security, which is mostly dorms that look like summer camp cabins, bunk beds, belongings stacked neatly in lockers, and inmates who have a schedule to go about their day as they choose, within reason. Then there's community custody, which is more like a halfway house. Inmates living in community custody have jobs outside the facility. They earn their own money, and they get to wear regular clothes most of the time. They have one foot in the real world and usually cause very little trouble. This post is deemed too dull for most officers, but after 3 years of running and gunning at Stragview, I was ready for something a little more boring. The major that runs the Midnight Ridge work camp is a friend of mine, you see. He heard I was looking for a change and decided to make me part of his team. So I put in my transfer, waited my customary 3 months for the wheels of bureaucracy to turn, and finally got my marching orders. I thought that after 3 years of hassle and bullcrap, I had finally arrived at a sort of early retirement. I had no idea. There are 3 shifts at work release. The first shift handles the morning, the busiest time of the day, and organizes the vans and the carpools that take our inmates to work. They monitor their GPS tracking and generally field phone calls and questions from the brass or family members. Second shift was responsible for the logistics of bringing everyone home, coordinating arrivals, making sure that by the time third shift arrived at 11, everyone was snug in bed and dreaming about tomorrow's workday. That's where my shift comes in. Third shift was by far the easiest of the 3 shifts. You sat behind a desk for 8 hours and watched the GPS points run for the day on a big monitor. You monitor phone records, call in counts to the control room, and try not to fall asleep. Other than that, not much happens. Third shift is also the only shift with just 1 person on it. That's because you don't have to deal with anyone until the sun rises, unless there's an emergency. I had ridden the 11 to 7 for about 3 months, and I had to say, it was the best post I'd ever had. I had to run chow at 4 a.m. and send 3 groups of loggers out at 5:30, but other than that, I rarely ever even saw an inmate unless I wanted to. That's probably how I lost my focus. I was out on a compound check when I first noticed the sound. Every night at midnight, I have to walk the compound and make sure that everything is locked up. Aside from the 2 dorms, there's a tool shop, a laundry room, a chemical shed, a motor pool, and a lawn shed where we keep the lawnmowers and weed eaters. It's also important to walk around to make sure the grounds are free of garbage and that no one's tried to drop off any care packages during the day. I've been told that sometimes people will do drug drops when all the inmates are at work. So we walk around periodically to check the drainage ditches and look for turned up turf that someone's hidden something under. So I was walking the ground with my headphones in, listening to Spotify as I made my way around. That's when a harsh noise cut into the music. It sounded like TV static, or the high ree of power lines. I took my headphones off and cleaned the jack, thinking that that was the culprit. Once I had them off, though, I realized that they weren't the culprit. The sound was coming from the yard. Figuring that it was an extra energetic cicada, I kept making my way around as I tried to find the source. By the time I had checked the last shed, the noise had stopped. I walked back in and set about the difficult task of finding something to watch on YouTube in between my hourly rounds. An hour later, I was sitting with my feet on the desk and listening to a creepy reading when something caught my eye on the security monitors. Most of the compound is wired with cameras. You've got one in the control room, one in the kitchen, one in each dorm, one in each of the sheds, and 4 that sit in various locations around the outside. One of them faces the only road in, another one sits on the parking lot, and the other 2 face the rec yard and the backwoods. I looked at the cameras again, sure I had seen something blip across the back cameras, and nearly flipped out of my chair as I caught sight of something on the rec yard. Someone, I guess, would describe it better. They were standing in the rec yard, right in the middle of the basketball court, and looking at the woods. The center had once been a lumber camp, and it's pretty far back in the woods. There's only one access road, and I hadn't seen anyone drive up it. We don't get a lot of foot traffic out here, being about 5 miles from the nearest road, but we do get visitors from time to time. The signs on the road are usually enough to deter anyone that wants to come this far, so the idea that someone had just walked out of the woods and onto my rec yard this late at night was a little hard to believe. I unlocked the cage where we kept the shotguns and headed out nonetheless. It wasn't an inmate, they were all locked down for the night, so it had to be someone from outside the camp. I came out of a side door, barrel leading, and peeked around the edge to get an idea of what I was dealing with. They were still there, all right, staring at the woods as they stood out on the blacktop. They were tall, around 6 feet, with a hood that obscured their face. The spotlight on the court showed me jeans and sneakers, and I began to think it might be a man. As I took in his profile and sized him up, I started to hear that high-pitched buzzing noise again. It followed me as I crept closer to the tool shed, and I had to squint as it seemed to buzz against my fillings. It was worse than before, the sound sliding across my mind like an ice skate, and as I swung around to challenge the man, I could feel my left eye twitching from the noise. I leveled the barrel at him as I challenged him in my loudest voice, the words stilted as that loud ree raked across me. "This is state property. You are not authorized to be here. State your business before I point my shotgun at an empty basketball court." I swept the barrel around, trying to listen for footfalls or heavy breathing. The guy had been there 1 minute and been gone the next, so if he were still here, I should be able to hear him. There was nowhere he could have made it in the couple of seconds it had taken me to come around the shed, and I was certain he had to be here somewhere. I'd seen him. The camera had seen him, and as I started walking around the shed, I tried to flush him out, challenging him every few minutes as I did so. It took a minute for me to realize that I could have heard him at all, because the loud ringing had disappeared from my ears. 30 minutes later, I had to accept that he had gotten away. The cameras, though. I made my way back to the control room, opening the door with my key, and sat down in front of the camera bank. I should have called Stragview, which is only about a mile up the road, but I wanted something more concrete than my word on it. The fact that he had disappeared had shaken me, and I needed someone else to have seen him. I rolled back the footage by an hour, panning forward slowly as I checked for figures. Maybe the cameras would show me where he'd gone to. I could go back out and find him, cover him until backup got there, and have a little excitement for a change. When I got to the point where I had noticed him on the camera, though, the blacktop was empty. I kept watching, thinking maybe I'd been wrong about the time, but when I rounded the corner with my shotgun a few minutes later, I rewound and looked again. There was no one there. The court was empty, until I got there at least. But I know I'd seen someone on camera. Hell, I'd seen him there when I rounded the shed. How could he have just gone? There was no more YouTube for me that night. I bird-dogged those cameras, my eyes sliding from screen to screen, trying to catch anything that might vindicate what I'd seen earlier. I knew what I'd seen. I'd seen a person out there, but there was nothing there now. The longer I went, though, the more I second-guessed myself. Maybe it had been a shadow. Perhaps I'd been seeing things. Maybe I just wanted there to be something out there. I was looking at the yard when something blipped near the woods. I was used to seeing raccoons and possums as they went about their business, maybe even an owl or a hawk. But whatever this was, it had been big. I panned around to the other cameras and thought I saw a similar large shape loping near the woods. It was too big to be a dog, maybe a mastiff, but I suppose it could be a large cat or something. We did get bear and cougar sightings every now and again, but this was too weird, especially on top of my prowler. When the courtesy phone rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The guy on the other end sounded as scared as I was. "Officer, it's Tabish in A-Dorm. We got a problem out here." The courtesy phone was how the inmates contacted me after the doors were locked. If one of them had a medical emergency or a fight broke out, that was how they got in touch with me. I had only heard it ring a few times, and mostly it was because I was late opening the doors for chow. Today, however, the guy on the other end sounded pretty scared. As scared as I felt, in fact. "What's going on?" I asked. "Well, something big ran past the window, like a cougar or something. Now there's something loud on the roof. Sounds like it's trying to get in." "The roof? What's on the roof?" "I don't know, sir. It sounds pretty big, and it's..." But suddenly there was a loud ripping sound from overhead, and I heard Tabish scream as it was overtopped by the ringing I had heard earlier. I slammed the phone into the cradle and picked up my shotgun as I turned towards the dorm. It took me 2 steps, though, for logic to rear its ugly head, and I realized that charging off without letting someone know was going to be a great way for me to end up dead. I picked up the phone again, dialing the number for the control room of Stragview, and praying that they hadn't had some kind of problem as well. Someone picked up on the second ring. "Stragview Reception Center, Control Room Officer Cleese speaking." I gave Cleese a short rundown on what was happening, and he assured me that he would send some officers out to help me. "Just don't leave the control room. Lock the doors and stay put until we get there. ETA is about 15 minutes, but it could be a half an hour. We're majorly understaffed tonight." "Do I need to call the police as well? Maybe the..." "No!" Cleese came back quickly and decisively. "We will handle this. Stay put and don't do anything stupid." Then he hung up on me, and I could swear I heard that weird static creeping in again through the line. I went around and made sure the doors were locked and tried to keep myself from moving towards the back. I was very curious about what was going on in the dorm, and I found myself walking towards the kitchens before I could think about it. I should, after all, go and make sure the kitchens were secured. It backed up onto the rec yard, and the dorms were beyond that, so if the doors weren't locked, something might get in, right? I had just slid the key into the lock that separated the offices from the kitchen when I heard the frantic pounding of fists. I threw the door open and saw a handful of scared inmates at the back door to the kitchen. They were pounding on the glass hard enough to send cracks running through it, and some of them were looking behind with terrified, jerky glances. Some of them stepped back when they saw the shotgun, but started pounding with more fervor when they saw I was the one holding it. "Please, let us in. These things out here are going to kill us." I glanced out back over the top of the drop sink and saw an abattoir spreading across the blacktop. The overhead lights near the woods and over the blacktop had burst, casting the whole space in a moonlight shadow. I could see large, loping creatures chasing scared inmates in the semi-darkness before burying them and savaging them with huge jaws. Their screams were a cacophony that I was surprised I was only now hearing, and many of them lay dead and bleeding across the blacktop. In the middle of it all stood a hooded man. He stood there amidst the chaos, taking it all in mildly from beneath his black hood. The beasts moved around him, long chitinous bodies moving gracefully, and I almost sensed his approval of it all. Had he brought them here? Were these his pets? My mind tried to make sense of it all, even as that skeletal reeing drove an ice pick into my brain. He turned then, his eyes meeting mine through the window, and I heard the screams dim a little as though someone had turned down a radio. His eyes bore into mine, and I could feel him root around in my brain like fingers over my scalp. The inmates at the door kept shrieking, but I hardly noticed when something came along and dragged them away. Many of the things seemed to be dragging my inmates towards the woods, but the man in the hood commanded my full attention. When he spoke in my head, it didn't even seem that odd. "We don't want you, watchman. Sleep and live to tell your friends what you've seen here. Oh, and be sure to give the warden a special message from me. Be sure to tell him that Reese sends his regards." Then that loud ringing reached a fever pitch, and I felt warmth trickling down the side of my head. My knees cut loose, and I split the left knee of my uniform pants as I crashed to the kitchen floor. I was suddenly assaulted by the loudest ringing I had ever heard, and it felt like a bolt of lightning was rocketing around in my skull. Fortunately, I didn't have long to suffer. I blacked out just as my hands came up to try to cover my bleeding ears. I wasn't aware of anything else until someone slapped me across the face, and I realized I was on the ground. They brought me to the prison and tossed me in a holding cell. That's where I'm awaiting the warden while he compiles the report from the work camp. From what I was told by the yard sergeant, a blunt man who came to interrogate me like a freaking inmate, all the inmates at the center are gone. I told him about the things, about the men, the bodies, and the blood out on the rec yard, but he didn't believe me. The sergeant said they hadn't found any bodies or blood there. The only person they found was me, asleep on the floor after making a disturbing call to the prison about someone attacking the work camp. The doors to the dorms were open, the locks missing, and they expect that there is now a roving band of inmates in the Stragview woods. The only person that seemed to believe me was the warden. He met me at the gate, asking me what had happened and what I had seen. I told him everything. I told him about the big creatures, like hunting cats, that had broken into the dorm, and the blip on the camera I'd seen as they moved around. I told him about the phone call from the inmate Tabish, where he had told me about the creatures that were trying to get into the dorm, and the static bursts as they made their way inside somehow. I told him about the man in the hood, even giving him the message that he had left for him. That was when the warden's carefully constructed cool had evaporated. "Hold him until I get back. I will have more questions for him." So here I sit to await my fate, thinking about the man who came to threaten the prison, and about the work release job I will likely never see again. "It's out by the dumpster. You better send the money. I could get fired for this." Mark sighed as he read the message, pulling on his pants as he grabbed his car keys. He'd have to be quick before someone figured out what it was. Kevin hadn't been wrong. He and Mark could get in trouble for what they were about to do. Kevin could get fired, but Mark could very easily be arrested for trespassing. He didn't work at the prison anymore, and Stragview didn't forget slights upon its honor like someone quitting. It didn't matter, though. He needed that damn chair. Mark had been working at Stragview for about 2 years when he finally hit the big time. When you were a male and relatively consistent in your work schedule, it was only a matter of time before they put you in confinement. The show, as many of them called it, had 3 quads, one of them being permanently sealed off for some reason, and was the bustling hub of the prison. The 2 guards he worked with, Sergeant Martin and Officer Rack, were solid as well, and they quickly figured out that Mark was a whiz when it came to paperwork and computer stuff. Both the old-timers, his counterparts having 10+ years beyond the fence, were more about flipping cells and keeping down problems than signing forms and housing new arrivals. As such, Mark was left in the bubble most of the time to run the nerve center of the unit, while his new friends went to the floor for fun and games. Mark was pretty good at keeping it all between the ditches, and that was when he discovered his real passion. Mark had dabbled in writing for years, but something about being inside the epicenter of segregation really brought out the best in his writing. Mark found the process of bunking inmates to be pretty easy, and the paperwork was tedious, but not too complicated. He usually finished his work fairly early in the evening, which left him lots of time to hone his craft. He'd been working on the same novel for years, a bit of grimdark sci-fi set in his own little universe, but he'd never really been motivated to finish it. The novel was a hobby, something to pass the time when he had nothing better to do. And now, as he sat and watched the 2 go about their daily chores, he found that he suddenly had nothing better to do. He fell in with both feet, and night after night he found himself at the keyboard of the dorm computer as he banged out chapter after chapter. The longer he worked on it, the more he realized that what he was writing was actually pretty good. Better than good, even. He was writing better than he'd ever written, and whether it was the ambience or some latent ability coming out in him, Mark found the pages were coming together easily. The story was great, and the descriptions painted a picture of his universe that he had never thought possible. The few people he let read it couldn't believe that he'd been the one to write it, and they pressured him to submit it. "Who knows," Sergeant Martin said after looking over it before chow one morning. "You might actually make it out of this shithole with a story like this." Mark had laughed at the time, but he couldn't have guessed how right the man would be. Mark pulled into the parking lot and looked for the dumpster. Kevin said that he'd put it behind the green dumpster next to admin, and as he drove around the ominous wooden building, he saw the dumpster in question. The lids were open, and Mark could see the flies swarming from here. The bag sat poking from the hole, black and glistening in the midday sun, and Mark hoped none of the smell would stick to his new chair. He had to be quick, he told himself, as he pulled up beside the dumpster and took one more look for anyone who might be watching. This was private property. If he was caught out here taking things from the dumpster, they could make trouble for him. He climbed out of the truck, a bag of trash in hand, as he approached the dumpster. He was just some guy from admin who was tossing some truck garbage, nothing out of the ordinary. As Mark came around to the side of the dumpster, letting the bag fly in a lazy arc, he saw what he had come for. The chair was beautiful, just as he remembered it. The wood on the armrests and the feet were stained a dark brown, the faux leather a deep, reverent blue. It would support his back and head, cradle it for maximum creativity. It hadn't changed a bit, and he wondered how they had let Kevin take it to the dumpster at all. A chair this pristine, this undamaged by careless boots and oversized backsides, came around once in a career. He suddenly didn't care who saw him. Mark lifted the chair gingerly and put it into the bed of the truck. He carried it the way he might his wife as he brought her over the threshold, and the blanket he had brought made for a buffer against the scratchy bed liner. As Mark lifted the tailgate, he couldn't help but smile at the chair as it lay there benignly. He had it, the last piece of the puzzle. Now he could finally get back to Mark? Mark stiffened, turning around slowly as a smile stretched painfully over his face. He recognized the voice, but her name escaped him. The smiling brunette was about a foot away from him, leaning out the window of her car as she greeted him. She'd been on Mark's shift. They had spoken many times on the occasions when he'd come to the captain's office or found himself on the yard, and Mark might have even considered asking her out once. Now she was an obstacle, one more thing to overcome, so he could return to his work. "I thought that was you. What's a big-time writer doing in a place like this?" Mark stepped closer to her car, grinning as he leaned down and hoped it looked natural. "Just had to come talk to HR about the rest of my vacation time. They still haven't paid me for all of it, and I could use the money until my royalty checks start evening out a little." He prayed silently behind that smile that she couldn't see the chair as it lay there in the bed of his F-150. It was his chair, and she couldn't have it. "I'm so jealous. We're so short-handed that I doubt I'll ever even get to use any of my vacation time. How have you been?" Good. Just enjoying doing what I love," he said, his mind screaming behind that smile. He had to go. He had to get out of here. He had to get back to what mattered. He made a little more small talk before she realized that she was going to be late and told Mark that she would see him around. He turned to go, glad to be free of her, when she suddenly called his name and brought him back around. He was like an overclocked spring, ready to snap if she so much as mentioned the chair. She had to have seen it. How could she not? It was beautiful, it was captivating, and anyone who saw it would have to have it. He'd kill her right here if she made him. He needed that chair. He'd snap her neck as she hung out the window if she... "Could you sign this for me?" she asked, taking a copy of his book off the passenger seat. "I'd been carrying it in the hopes I might see you around. It'd be great to have a signed copy." Mark sighed in relief, scratching his name on the inside cover before handing it back. He waved as she pulled off, wishing him well as she rolled towards the employee parking lot. She hadn't even found a spot before Mark was speeding out of the lot and back onto the road towards Kashmir. No more distractions. Mark had work to do. The book hadn't been an immediate success. No one had appeared to publish it. No fairy godmother had poofed into existence to make his dreams come true. Mark had shopped the novel around after proofing it for the 5th time, and found someone willing to take a chance on a first-time writer. To their surprise, however, the novel had taken off after some shaky reception. It wasn't everyone's cup of tea. Grimdark tales rarely were. But as it found its audience, Mark was astonished at the praise he received. When the publisher called to let him know that he'd broken 1,000 copies, he was tickled. When they called a week later to inform him that it was more like 50,000 copies, Mark was astonished. When he hit the New York Times bestseller list, he had taken a 2-week vacation so he could do a few interviews on some local TV spots. When his agent called him to let him know that Amazon was interested in a TV adaptation, Mark knew he had arrived. By then, Mark was already writing his resignation letter. He was thankful to the prison and what they had helped him accomplish, but he would need more time to focus on his work. Amazon was hoping for his take on a script that they were putting together, and there were already rumblings for a sequel. The show writers were interested in a chance of a sequel too, and Mark figured he better get writing one. He already started the first couple of chapters, and as he said goodbye to Stragview, he thought his life might truly be about to begin. 2 weeks later, as he sat in front of his brand new computer with nothing to show for it, he started to wonder what had gone wrong. Mark tried everything in his power, but the ideas just wouldn't come. He tried taking his laptop to different places. He tried consuming different kinds of media or music as he wrote. He tried immersing himself in different genres, but nothing brought the muse back. His editor was clamoring for new pages, but Mark couldn't give him what he wanted. The Amazon reps were complaining that his notes on the script were lacking too. They wanted big ideas, concepts for the show. But Mark couldn't come up with anything. The more he racked his brain, the less work he seemed to do. And the only conclusion he could come up with was the last time he had found good output was when he had worked at Stragview. Mark cast that idea aside, though. That couldn't be it. The prison was such a hectic environment, an unpredictable setting, couldn't possibly be conducive to a productive writing environment. It had to be something else. That's how it all began. That was the start of the madness. He pulled his truck into the backyard and came to rest outside the large shed he had purchased. It was no humble storage shed, not by a long shot, and as he took the chair out of the bed of the truck, he felt giddy with anticipation. This was it, the final piece, the last thing he needed to make everything perfect. As the door came open, Mark looked once more upon the monstrosity he had created, and was proud. When he had contacted Kevin about getting some things, his old partner had been hesitant. Mark wanted pictures, layouts, specifics on brands of desks and computers, and Kevin had wanted to know why. Once Mark offered to pay him, though, the questions became a little less important. Mark had constructed the desk first, a long workspace made of formica and wood, every chip and every dig the same as the one that had sat in G-Dorm, thanks to Kevin's photos. Then the computer, an old 2005 model that Mark had picked up pretty cheap. Having it come with the same OS and program was a little more expensive, but nothing too ridiculous. Then came every basket, every folder, every coffee cup, every roach stain present in the booth, a microwave from a yard sale, a coffee pot from a Dollar General, paper and flyers, and all of them custom printed. It took months of work, but when Mark finally looked at the finished product, he knew he'd done it. When he sat down to work, however, he knew immediately something wasn't right. The windows had been wood instead of metal, but the computer monitors that he played the security footage through were a stroke of genius. The footage had been hard to talk Kevin into, but the money had gone a long way. Kevin was in a lot of debt, like most COs Mark knew, and the cash he was getting from this little project was likely helping him dig himself out of it. At least Mark hoped it was, but he really didn't care what Kevin wasted his money on. When the windows and the familiar views didn't help, that's when Mark realized what he needed. The chair was a piece of it, likely the most important, and as he sat down now, he felt sure this would be the moment he'd been waiting for. He booted up the computer, reveling in the old clicks and clacks that aged system made as it came up. He watched the inmates press their faces against the glass as Sergeant Martin and Kevin, Officer Rack, began their count for the day. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes as he soaked in the ambience, and knew that his moment had come. He opened Windows Office, selected a new document, and set to work. An hour later, he slammed his head against the desk and cried. The ideas wouldn't come. This had all been for nothing, an expensive nothing at all, and now he had nothing to show for it. He was sunk, finished, his candle quenched before its time. Quite an impressive setup you have here. He jumped as the voice wafted over him, and spun to find the warden leaning in the door of his shed. The warden was the last person he had expected to find here, and he stood up at attention before he could stop himself. The warden laughed, striding in as he took in the scene. He was such an odd creature, and the sight of him outside the walls of Stragview was a little alarming. The warden never left the compound. At least, Mark didn't think he had ever heard of him doing as much. Now he was here, standing inside Mark's shed and judging his efforts. And Mark wasn't sure what he expected. Security footage, pictures of secure locations within the prison, a chair with the maintenance ID still engraved upon it. I've got enough here to have the police put you away for a very long while. I could probably get Officer Rack too while I'm at it. But I've got a much better idea. Mark shuddered as he watched the man circle like a shark, still not sure what he expected. This isn't going to work, Officer Danbury. This hollow shell isn't going to give you what you need. And I think you understand that now, don't you? Mark nodded, hanging his head in defeat. You need the magic that hangs around Stragview. Something you can't get from a chair and a desk. You happen to be in luck, because I need something as well. He stopped then, and as he smiled at Mark, he could swear the man's eyes glittered like brimstone. I need staff that are loyal to me, loyal to Stragview. Staff who know that if they choose to desert me, I can take that which they covet at a moment's notice. You want to write, to continue to grow your star. You need Stragview as much as it needs you. The two stood and stared at each other for a count of 5 before Mark asked the question the old shark had been waiting for. When do I start? Oh, you'll have to go through orientation again, since you've quit. You might even have to prove to your old captain that you belong in confinement again, but I think you'll make it back sooner than you think. Orientation for new hires starts Monday, and I'll expect you in the training building promptly at 5 a.m. Mark wanted to protest, but he knew now what the price for disobedience would be. He nodded, watching the warden step out of his shed as he walked towards the road. Mark saw no car, no means of conveyance, and wondered how the old imp had gotten here so quickly. And Officer Danbury, the warden said, drawing Mark up sharply, next time you think about leaving to pursue greener pastures, remember how far the warden's grass stretches. The warden left him to his contemplation then, smiling as he felt the weight settle on his newest acolyte's soul. None of them understood the magic of Stragview better than he. It was why he'd built the prison there in the first place. Some of them might tap into that deep wellspring that lay beneath Stragview, but none of them would ever understand it. It gave them visions, it helped them thrive, but in the end, it only added strings that the warden could use to make them dance. It was the third inmate that week we'd found dead in his cell. Inmate deaths aren't exactly uncommon in a prison setting. Some guys realize this is going to be their life, and they decide to end it. Some people run afoul of a criminal element, and they pay the price. Some people are just placed in a cell with the wrong person, and when they snap hard. Edward Wargrave appeared to be one of the former. He had cut himself from ear to ear, and he died with the most fulfilled look of joy on his face. His cellmate had woken up to discover him like this, face down on his bunk and cold as a block of ice. When we had rolled the doors at 4:30 a.m. for breakfast, he'd been sitting on the top bunk, shaking as his roommate lay in a pool of congealing blood. I was currently standing in the cell with the inspection team, such as it was. Captain Darvin, my shift supervisor, the Inspector General, a beefy man named Halk, the Assistant Warden, Clive, and myself. Clive was acting as the Warden's representative in this matter, and his enthusiasm was a little creepy. Most Assistant Wardens would have hung back and taken notes, but Clive seemed to want to stay close enough to smell the man's last meal. I saw Halk move him out of the way several times so that he and the captain could get a better look at the body. It was Halk's job to do a formal inspection, and the Weasley little man was clearly getting on his nerves. Clive was a new addition to the staff, and no one really seemed to like him. He was thin to the point of emaciation, a fact that was not helped by his height. The man was about 5 feet tall, and even that height was gained on tiptoe sometimes. He had a pinched face and an unfortunate nose that looked more concave than anything. He seemed to delight in any sort of suffering that he could find, and he already had a reputation with the inmates as someone best avoided. I yawned, already ready to be done with this. It was 4:45 in the morning, and I already knew there would be another 3 hours of paperwork for something like this. I had been acting as Security 9, a position directly under the captain, for about 6 months now. It's not a bad gig, mostly a lot of paperwork and running around. You're the captain's right hand in many ways, and you often act as his representative on matters. You're also responsible for making sure that everything runs smoothly on the compound, which can sometimes be a little daunting. After several years of working as an officer, it wasn't too overwhelming a task, and I took to it quickly. The strange deaths didn't start happening until recently. 5 inmates in the last month and a half had been found in their cells. They had all committed suicide, cutting their throats from ear to ear, before dying with the most profound look of happiness on their face. All of them were different, and there was no real pattern to any of them. The first one had been a young guy, only here about 6 months, while Wargrave was a lifer who had been incarcerated for the last 15 years. The other 3 had ran the gambit, somewhere in the middle, and there was no gang affiliation or demographic to connect any of them. The warden was keeping it all very hush-hush from the outside world, which was why we were investigating it. Keep it inside the gate was our general MO 90% of the time, especially after the Captain Peterson incident. Halk was talking to Wargrave's cellmate. The little man was beside himself, blubbering and talking very fast about how he had been asleep, and the officer had just seen him an hour ago snoring, so he couldn't have been the one to do this. The kid was all of 22, and doing a short sentence for battery. He did not want to get more time, or get hemmed up over some nonsense, like his cellmate killing himself. As they loaded Wargrave onto the stretcher, his arm flopped out bonelessly. That's how I noticed the new tattoo. The skin around the word Jesse was red and angry looking. Prison tattoos are rarely particularly beautiful, and are a great way to get a nasty case of hepatitis if you're lucky. This one, however, was exceptionally inflamed looking. It almost looked as though someone had branded him, as opposed to just marking his skin with ink. I mentioned it to the inspector, and he nodded, saying they would make a note of it on his chart, since they were supposed to keep track of any new tattoos. Then the stretcher left with Wargrave, and the captain and I returned to the office to start paperwork. I didn't think about the tattoo again until a couple of days later, as I was directing inmates to chow. I was directing D-Dorm towards the chow hall, when we were stopped by a group returning from the chow hall. You didn't want to let them get too close to each other if you could help it. That was usually how drugs got exchanged or people got stabbed. So I stopped them at the corner and let the new group go on ahead, turning left as they headed for their dorm. As I stood there, I noticed a familiar tattoo on the first man's arm and squinted at it. It was fresh, the arm still inflamed looking. It had the same look Wargrave's had. The ink was possessed of an almost burnt look. It looked as though someone had gently branded him with the name Jesse, the name done in cursive. The squiggles supposed to look cute, I supposed. There was nothing cute about the tattoo, though. It looked painful, like it would itch and be very uncomfortable. It seemed that this Jesse would never be far from his mind, or the attention of his dirty fingernails. Inmate, and as he looked up, I realized that I knew this one. Myers, when'd you get that new ink? Myers, a scrawny white boy in his early 30s who had never really lost that look of 16, looked at me almost guiltily. Tattooing in prison is an offense that can get you put in confinement, and failure to give up your artist is just as bad. Of course, tattling on your tattoo artist is a great way to get stabbed, so most choose to go to the box instead. Myers made to cover the tattoo, but seemed to think better of it. I'd seen it, so there was no use pretending it didn't exist. He slumped a little and looked about shiftily before responding. "Just the name of my girl, Sarge." I gave him a mistrustful look. "That's not fresh ink, is it?" He shook his head dumbly, and about that time the line began to move. I let him go, not wanting to hold up chow over a new tattoo, but I made a note of it to check on him later. 2 inmates with the same name on them was a little suspicious. At least, that's what I thought at the time. We concluded chow, getting everyone packed back in, and then I went to the captain's office to start my evening work. Honestly, I would have probably forgotten about the tattoos completely, if it weren't for the paperwork that Captain Darvan dropped on my desk at 9 o'clock that night. He had a haggard look these days. These inmate deaths were really starting to get to him. Brass was on his ass about finding out why so many inmates were committing suicide, and he really wanted to tell them something substantial. "I've got to finish typing up my reports for the Wargrave suicide. Could you go through these and make sure everything looks right? I've been through them so many times that the words are starting to run together. I think a fresh set of eyes might be just what I need." I told him I would, and I pulled the files over. I hadn't really been doing anything anyway, just reviewing count slips and going over our logs to make sure they had been turned in this morning. Going over this busy work would be just what I needed to kill the time until the 11 o'clock count came up, and it was time to count these guys yet again. It wasn't until I had started going through the second file that I noticed something scribbled on the front under defining marks. Someone had written Jesse under tattoos in a thick, blocky script. The location was inmate Cohen's neck, and the word Jesse jumped out at me like a ghost in a funhouse. I switched back to the first file, an inmate named Clark, and looked over defining marks to find that he also had a tattoo that read Jesse. This one had been on his calf, but the coincidence was just too much to overlook. I fumbled through the following 3 files, seeing all 5 inmates with Jesse tattoos on some part of their body. They had all been handwritten, meaning that they were likely fresh ink, and the fact that all of them had been written in seemed to indicate that these were not something they had come to prison with. It was all just a little too weird to overlook as circumstance. I brought it to the captain's attention, but he cut me off and told me to just file the paperwork. I've got enough on my plate without worrying about whatever goddamn thing inmates are getting tattooed on themselves. Just get it done, or I'll find someone else that can and maybe give them your post. Captain Darvan was clearly feeling the squeeze, and I couldn't hold his outburst against him. So I finished the paperwork and told him I'd take it down to the inspector's office and put it in his box. He waved me off and said to hurry back because it would be count time in about 30 minutes. I took the load of files and went to the admin hallway to drop them off. As I left the captain's office, I couldn't help but get a prickle on the nape of my neck as I stood in the shadow of the warden's tower. He had moved his office to that old rat-infested place, and many of us felt like he had taken up residence there. You could see him sometimes on the catwalk as he walked around the tower, just staring at people. It was damn creepy. The warden himself being damn creepy too. This was not something I would have shared with anyone, because you never knew when the warden was watching, or what he might hear. He had been at Stragview for a long, long time, and sometimes firing people wasn't the worst thing he could do. People had disappeared and never been seen again. Some of them had been seen again, and that was almost worse. I hurried across the yard so as not to linger under his supposed sight, and was soon in the admin hallway. I had expected to put the files in the inspector's box that sat on the wall outside his office. To my surprise, though, the light was on and the door was open. Inspector Halk sat at his desk, one big hand resting against his head as he dozed. The last few weeks had been hell for him too. 5 dead inmates, even those dead at their own hands, was hard to explain on paperwork. He was clearly getting the squeeze from someone higher up as well, and not having any luck figuring it out. He jerked awake when I knocked, and told me to come in. I set the files on his desk, telling him they were from Captain Darvan. He thanked me and said he would get right on them. I started to leave right then and there, but I turned on a whim and asked him if he'd noticed the tattoos. He blinked at me and asked me what I was talking about, offering me a seat. I pointed out to him that all 5 inmates had Jesse tattooed on them in a relatively fresh sort of way. They had all been recently marked with that name, and then they had all died. I wasn't sure what it meant, but it seemed a little too convenient to me. Halk raised an eyebrow. "You gunning for my job or something?" I told him at the moment it didn't look like much fun, and he laughed, telling me to show him what I was talking about. I opened up the case files and showed him the hastily scrawled tattoo descriptions on a few of them. He nodded and said that was weird, but not the weirdest thing he'd ever seen. He thanked me for the information, saying that it did tie them all together somehow. That was when I told him about the inmate I'd seen with a fresh tattoo, and he perked up a bit. "Do you mind coming with me to see him? If he has the same tattoo, he might have some information on this. If this isn't one big coincidence, that is." I told him I didn't mind at all, and we set out for D-Dorm to get inmate Myers. We came in through the side door and nodded at the guard in the booth, approaching and telling her quietly that we were here to see inmate Myers. She pointed me to a bunk towards the back, and the other inmates parted as we approached. Like most open bay dorms, D-Dorm is set up like a bunkhouse. There are lots of bunk beds with foot lockers in front of them, and about 150 men sleep across 2 similar sides. Myers was set near the fire door towards the end of the bunkhouse, but his bed was empty when we arrived. I asked some of the others, and one of them told me that he had went to the bathroom. He was acting kind of weird, just suddenly got up and walked to the bathroom like someone in a dream. We beat feet to the bathroom and found Myers sitting on the toilet. He was fully clothed, with his head down and his hands in his lap. I thought for a moment that he might be praying, but he was dead silent and seemed to have taken no notice of us. "Myers, the inspector wants a word with you. You aren't in any trouble. He just wants to talk to you about some things." Myers didn't move. "Come on, Myers, don't make a scene. I told you you're not in any trouble. The man just..." But that's when I put a hand on his shoulder and noticed how still he was. As if from my touch, he fell over. His head hit the tile wall of the bathroom stall, and that was when his throat began to bleed. We were suddenly in a pool of blood, and Myers was staring sightlessly at the opposite wall beneath the urinal. Captain Darvin was less than pleased to get a call about yet another inmate suicide. He was even less pleased to discover Inspector Halk and I were already there. "I told you not to go sticking your nose into this," Darvin whispered roughly to me as we stood outside the dorm. "I told you just to go deliver files and leave this alone. If you can't follow orders, don't chastise your officer for showing some initiative," Halk rumbled, walking out of the dorm and glowering at Darvin. If he hadn't mentioned it, I wouldn't have put 2 and 2 together. He deserves a commendation, not a dressing down. Captain Darvin looked a little put out about being spoken to in such a way, but he grunted and stalked away, as Halk and I stood outside the dorm and talked about what would come next. Fortunately, the answer seemed to find us. As we stood making plans outside the dorm, someone tapped on the window and looked out at the 2 of us. It was an inmate, someone I recognized. Sullivan held up an angry red tattoo on his arm as we stared back at him. Like Myers, the tattoo looked more like a burn than fresh ink. Sullivan's eyes told us all we needed to know, and I could see that Halk had come to the same conclusion. The man was scared and was willing to break the code of silence in order to make this fear go away. We took Sullivan down to the inspector's office and told him to tell us all that he knew. He was hesitant at first. They all are, but when their own safety is at stake, they'll usually spill their guts. "So, I was asleep about 3 nights ago, when my dream was interrupted by this girl." "A girl?" I asked skeptically. "In here?" "Not precisely. I was having a dream I've had before. The time I robbed the bank that landed me in here. In real life, it had all went south pretty bad, and in the dream, it was going even worse. The cops had machine guns and rocket launchers, and they was blowing us up, and really just making a mess out of it. I was hunkered behind the teller desk, clutching my automatic pistol and just praying to God to make it all go away. Then I look up, and there's this girl standing in front of me. She says if I wanted it all to go away, she could help. She said she can make everything better, and all I have to do is take her hand." "I'm guessing she wasn't there on the day in question," Halk asked. "If she had been, I guess I wouldn't be doing 25 to life," Sullivan said. "You jokers want to hear the rest of the story, or you want to keep interrupting me?" We both nodded to him to continue, and he went on. "So I take her hands. Why not? It's just a dream after all. And then it felt like my arm was on fire. The flames seemed to creep over my forearm, and I tried to pull them away from her. But her grip was like iron, and she just held me there as her smile got wider and wider. Then she turned my arm over, and I could see the name that was printed there. The name Jesse looked like it had been branded into me, and she said that I belonged to her now. She also said that she'd be back for what was hers later. Then what happened? I asked. I woke up and saw that her name was on me. That's when I realized that it might have been a little more than a dream. That's when Myers approached me, showing me his own markings. He said that Jesse had come to him in a dream as well, saying that she could help him escape his current situation. There were quite a few of them, actually, 8 or 9, but now I guess there might only be a couple of us. I asked him for the names of the ones that were left, but he refused to tell. You know what happens to snitches in here. They'll have to come forward on their own, but I need your help now. After Myers, I was the first one to get my brand. Everyone before Myers is dead now, and I'm afraid that I'm going to be next. I need help, and I'll gladly say whatever you need me to say so that this Jesse doesn't get me. Halk signed the orders right then and there, and we put him under surveillance. We had him in an isolation cell down in medical, telling them that he was a witness to the murders that had been happening on the compound. Halk put me on duty that first night, watching him and sitting with him, but nothing happened. I watched the second night as well, and the night after that. I came in on my off days to sit with him, and on the 5th day, something finally happened. I was drowsing. 5 days of 12-hour shifts will do that to you, and I had already decided that tomorrow I would let someone else take this for a night or two. It was about 2 a.m. when my chair threatened to spill me over, and I realized I'd been sleeping. I looked up into the small room where we were keeping him, and saw that Sullivan wasn't alone in there. Someone was standing over him, and as they stroked his thinning hair, he shuddered in his sleep. I was speechless for a moment, unsure of what to do. The woman was tall and thin to the point of gauntness. Her long silver hair hung down in front of Sullivan's face. As it touched him, he shuddered violently. Then she bent down and pressed her lips to his ear, whispering to him and telling him something he didn't seem to want to hear. His eyes snapped open suddenly, and the pupils had become black and staring like a doll's eyes. I was up and banging on the glass, asking her just what the hell she thought she was doing in there. She smiled at me, her lips pulled back in a feral grin that made my testicles pull up into my chest. It was a decidedly cannibalistic sort of grin, the sort of grin that hinted she might come after me once she had finished with him. Sullivan had gotten to his feet, looking around the little room as if trying to figure out what to do. There were no weapons here, no bunks to hang yourself from, no ledges to jump from, but he seemed to have found something nonetheless. He lowered his head and began to run at the wall, intent on breaking his neck. I stepped up to the door, pushing the key in the lock and trying to make it open. The key stopped about halfway around though, not wanting to connect and open the door. I bent over the key, trying to make my weight force it open, but the more I pushed, the more the key groaned and threatened to break. I began to panic, not knowing what to do. They would never believe that some ghost woman had broken in and killed Sullivan. They would think that he had decided to kill himself, and I had simply sat here and watched it happen. Then a pair of strong hands encircled mine, taking the keys and pushing me aside. I looked up and realized it was the warden. He was smiling down at me with that slightly serpentine face of his, and as he pushed me against the wall, ever so gently, he told me not to move and just to stand. Then he proceeded into the isolation cell, and I was treated to the sound of Sullivan nearly cracking his skull on the wall as he ran a second time. The woman, I suppose she was Jesse, looked up at him with something like terror mixed with curiosity. I couldn't see what lay in the warden's eyes, since he had his back to me, but she began to back away as he forced her into a corner. Her face still looked as a predator's must when faced with a larger predator, unsure if they can share the food, or if the larger one means to have it all, and them as well. Then, as the warden finally pinned her to the corner, she began to scream, and I placed my hands over either side of my head as I tried to muffle that piercing sound. I could feel it vibrate in my bones, hear it wavering over my senses, and I felt that I must surely shatter if I was forced to endure it for much longer. I slid to the ground, surprised not to feel blood running through my fingers. and put my head between my knees as I prayed for it to end. It seemed my prayers were answered, because the screaming abruptly stopped. I looked up to see the warden towering over me, Sullivan lying on the floor as his head bled and his neck bruised. The warden just smiled, and I became afraid that he would silence me as easily as he had Jesse. I would suggest that you call medical ASAP. It would appear that inmate Sullivan has had a psychotic break and will need some medical attention. I won't tell anyone about your nap on the floor, so long as you don't mention anything about Mr. Sullivan's nighttime visitor. Agreed? I nodded dumbly, and he patted my head, his strange, scaly fingers rasping over my hair. He started walking away then, but stopped suddenly, and left me with one more thing to ponder before returning to his tower. Please tell Inspector Hulk that the situation we spoke of earlier has been taken care of. If there's one thing I can't stand in this world, it's a fucking poacher. Then he left, and I was forced to call medical and get Sullivan some help. Sullivan had nearly cracked his skull, and his neck was badly bruised where he had wrenched it against the wall. He would spend the next few weeks in medical, to be sure, and Hulk sent me home to get some rest. When I told him what the warden had said, privately, of course, he went a little pale and just nodded. He said he didn't want any details. He didn't want to know what had happened. He just told me to go get some sleep. Laying here awake, however, trying to forget what I saw, is a little harder than expected. I watched the warden, a man who signs my checks and commands the respect of nearly every warm body on the compound, kill what I suspect was a restless spirit. The more I try to puzzle it out, the more questions I seem to discover. The longer I lay here, trying to make sense of it all, the more I wonder what will happen to those men marked by Jesse, who still live on the compound. The longer I think about it, the more I think it might be time to take that vacation I've been putting off.